Today, to kick off our series on existentialist philosophers, we're looking at the most famous existentialist philosopher of all, Jean-Paul Sartre.
How famous was he?
Jean-Paul Sartre was so famous, he turned down the Nobel Prize in Literature because, he didn't do prizes. Jean-Paul Sartre was so famous.
How famous was he?
Jean-Paul Sartre was so famous that when he returned to Paris from a trip overseas in the 1970s, the screaming crowd that greeted him was bigger than the one that showed up for the Rolling Stones the previous week, and thousands used to turn out to his lectures, his plays, even his funeral. Jean-Paul Sartre was so famous.
How famous was he?
How many more of these Jean-Paul Sartre was so famous callbacks are we going to do, PB? Because I'm running out of anecdotes about how famous Jean-Paul Sartre was. Oh wait, no I'm not. Jean-Paul Sartre was so famous.
How famous was he?
Jean-Paul Sartre was so famous that he had a rock star level of drug intake. One biographer estimates that in a day Sartre would smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day and several pipefuls of tobacco, drink over a litre of alcohol, that's a quarter of a gallon of alcohol for you Americans in your nonsense measuring system, gulp down 200 milligrams of amphetamines, several grams of barbiturates, 15 grams of aspirin, as well as coffee, tea, and a range of other substances. Most infamously, he decided one day out of the blue that he wanted to experience tripping balls, as I believe the French expression translates, and he had a friend who was a doctor inject mescaline straight into his veins. The result was that for the rest of his life, Sartre would sometimes find himself running in a panic from a horde of invisible crabs that would chase him down the street. That's how famous Jean-Paul Sartre was. And on his tombstone, to this day, it reads, "Don't try this at home, kids." Okay, that bit's not true. It just says Jean-Paul Sartre 1905 to 1980, but it should be true. So who was Jean-Paul Sartre? What was his philosophy? And is it any good? Stay tuned and find out. G'day, I'm Drew, the philosopher Philibot keeps captive here within the interstellar void, and today we're diving into the individual philosophers of existentialism, who they were, what they argued, and why you should take a closer look at them. And hold on to those berets, because in this video in particular, we're looking at the biggest existentialist of the bunch. Well, at least of the French bunch. And that's a group of philosophers who went through the Second World War together, wrote books together, famously had apricot cocktails together, and were the closest of friends. What's also interesting about them is that despite being grouped together as existentialist philosophers and sharing a range of philosophical commitments, they disagreed with each other a lot, sometimes to the point of ending lifelong friendships over a single argument. Now, in the previous video, we discussed the broad philosophical commitments that existentialists shared. Link up here if you're interested. There's Project Runway Season 8 jokes. But before we start, it's worth reminding ourselves what the 6 basic predicates or rules of existentialism are. First, God is dead, or at least unknowable, and can't tell us what to do. Second, existence precedes essence, meaning we're born into a world of stuff, and it's up to us what to make of it. Third, the world is meaningless and absurd. Things just happen. Fourth, we have consciousness and can reflect on the world and ourselves, even our own consciousness, which is pretty special but comes with consequences. Fifth, we're all going to die. And because our lives are finite, we should pay close attention to what we do with our time and make sure we're not wasting it doing what other people want. And 6, we are absolutely free and have the ultimate responsibility both for what we do and what we make of our lives. So that's great. We've got the existentialist rulebook. But if these claims are true, how do they play out in philosophy and in real life? And this is where it's helpful to look at the lives and philosophies of individual existentialists, because they very much disagree. In other words, French existentialists, who are... And the first existentialist we're looking at is a big one, the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. First, a word on pronunciation. Yes, the correct pronunciation of his name is
Sartre.
But I don't have a beautiful French accent. Instead, my undergraduate lecturers would anglicise his name to either Sartre or Sartre, and it's engraved deep within my brain now, so sorry about that. But as I mentioned at the top of the video, Jean-Paul Sartre was pretty famous. And all of this for someone who was, and this is objectively, the ugliest philosopher who ever lived. And that's a title with a lot of competition. Looking at you, Friedrich Nietzsche, is that mustache really working? Yet reportedly, he had more charisma than all of the Tom Cruises who've ever existed squished together. Oh, quick note. For all of you back on Earth who may not know this, a philobot tells me that every time a Tom Cruise dies doing like a stunt or Dianetics or something, they clone him and they print out another one. Apparently the film Mickey 17 was based on Tom Cruise. And Jean-Paul Sartre's sex life, well, let's just say there's a separate video coming out on the sex lives of philosophers, including Sartre's, very soon. Stay tuned. But Sartre's life before the Second World War was a pretty modest one. He was born in 1905 and lost his father to an illness when he was only 2. Sartre spent most of his life caring for his mother, who actually moved in with him into an apartment in Paris, even while he was the most famous philosopher
in the world.
He graduated from France's most prestigious university, became a school teacher, and briefly served during the Second World War in a weather observation unit. Importantly, he was actually a German prisoner of war when France was occupied. But pretty amusingly, one day he just went to the guard at the prison gate and said, "Yeah, hey, I've got a doctor's appointment in town," and the guard let him leave. And he never returned. So he went to Paris and stayed there until the end of the war. He was already a little famous for his novel Nausea, and he used the time during the Second World War to develop his philosophy into what would then commonly become known as existentialism. Most interestingly, Sartre's philosophy is a philosophy of lived experience. In it, you'll find normal people confronting everyday dilemmas. At the end of the war, he gave a crucially important lecture to a huge crowd, entitling it Existentialism is a Humanism, and you can still read it today. If you wanted to get into the basics of existentialism and Sartre's thought, then reading this very short lecture is really the easiest way to do it. But if you do, you can actually skip the commentary at the start and the question time, which gets progressively weirder at the end, and just jump straight to the core of the lecture. In it, you've got what Sartre thought existentialism was and why, in the aftermath of the Second World War, it was his view that existentialism was the only sensible way to live. Because even throughout his other door-stoppers of a book, like Being and Nothingness, for example, or the Critique of Dialectical Reason Part 2, Sartre's basic conception of what the world is like and how we should live in it never really changed. In his lecture on existentialism, Sartre said that man first exists. He materializes in the world, encounters himself, and only afterwards defines himself. He will not be anything until later, and then he will be what he makes of himself. Man is nothing other than his own project. He exists only to the extent that he realizes himself, therefore he is nothing more than the sum of his actions, responsible for what he is, free, condemned to be free, committing himself to life. Man is nothing other than what he makes of himself. This is the first principle of existentialism. And we should note that even in those archaic times, for the purposes of Sartre's philosophy, women can be men too, and indeed all people can. So what does all of that mean? And how does it intersect with our basic rules of existentialism? Well, I'd summarise it in 4 key ideas. The first idea is if you live in the world, then you must make choices about how to live and what to do. You do this in the present, conscious of your past, and you bear full responsibility for the decisions you make. Sartre later says that the first effect of existentialism is to make every man conscious of what he is and to make him solely responsible for his own existence. Second idea, in order to choose, you must have projects. Something that you are trying to do with your life and get done before you inevitably depart. So critically, you also imagine your future. Sartre says that man is, before or else, something that projects itself into a future and is conscious of doing so. Third idea, your project must be authentic, something you actually want to do with your life. not something someone else wants you to do, or something you think you should be doing but are not really sure. You've got limited time on this mortal coil, so what you do with your life has to have a purpose rooted deeply in your existence and your own being. And idea number 4, and here's the kicker. For Sartre, your choices and the projects they forward have to be the right thing to do. Not morally right, because Sartre thinks that there is no outside morality that determines whether something is right or wrong, and not ethically right, in the sense that institutions or conventions or expectations dictate what it is you should do, but what is right for you. What your experience of the world and your unique subjectivity holds is authentically right and true for you. The thing that you would have any other person do in your place if they faced the same situation in the same time you did and had to act. And Sartre has an interesting intuition about these kinds of choices. He thinks that if you take them seriously and act from the core of what you think is right, and you reflect on the fact that you are choosing in that moment and you are choosing it for all time, stolen from Nietzsche, and for everybody else, then you will almost certainly choose the course that increases freedom. Your own freedom and that of others. It's in this choice, which may be a deeply political one, that Sartre thinks we come together and fight for the most universal value of all, freedom. Now, if you fail to choose what is right for you and fail to follow the call of your authentic self, then Sartre thinks you're in what he calls bad faith. And in his philosophy, only bad things come from bad faith. You fool yourself about what you want, about what is right, and you deny your absolute freedom, perhaps by doing nothing, which he points out is a sort of choosing in and of itself, while you're pretending not to choose. Or you can be in bad faith by letting some other person deciding for you, and they can't. In fact, many of the examples in Jean-Paul Sartre's later work, which is, I'll remind you again, Being and Nothingness, this chunky boy, concerns the varieties of bad faith. For example, there's a student who goes out on a date and convinces herself it isn't a date, and then a whole bunch of misunderstandings flow from that. Or the waiter, who performs his job perfectly but is only really kind of pretending or playing at being a waiter while denying he's not really a waiter because it's ultimately not who he thinks he is and not what he wants to be. Or there's the friend who wants to help by taking over another person's life and making all of their choices for them. According to Sartre, these are all forms of bad faith. Because, according to Sartre's existentialism, you're absolutely free, must choose, and these choices constitute who you are. You build these choices into projects and what you imagine for your future. Further, according to Sartre, these choices and their projects can be authentic, or they can be in bad faith. And the latter is bad because you've only got so much time on Earth and your choices affect more than just yourself. So you better make them worthwhile. It also leads Sartre to some key terms that are often associated with the existential condition. Things like being, condemned to be free, abandoned, and in anguish. Sartre says, this is what I mean when I say that man is condemned to be free. Condemned because he did not create himself, yet nonetheless free because once cast into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. And this is what abandonment implies. It is we, ourselves, who decide who we are to be. Such abandonment entails anguish. And on anguish, he says, it is anguish pure and simple, of the kind experienced by all who have borne responsibilities. Sartre's version of existentialism is powerful because it starts with simple premises like you're absolutely free and can only choose for yourself, and it applies them to concrete everyday situations. No matter what he's writing about, you can always kind of see 4 existentialist concepts resting at the back of his mind: choice, projects, authenticity, and their consequences for everybody. Now, there's a lot to take away here and apply in our own lives, but there are also a lot of difficulties in Sartre's version of existentialism. It is pretty absolute in its application and in Sartre's eyes, and it can sometimes be overwhelming. Particularly the idea that every action, including inaction, is a choice, and that fundamentally for you, there is a right answer. It gives rise to this feeling of dread, because you can't escape the necessity to choose and the risk that you might get it wrong. And it creates what Sartre and other existentialists call abandonment. We didn't ask to have all of this responsibility and choice, and in making a choice for ourselves, Sartre thinks that we're also choosing for all others too. But here we are, thrown into the world, left without a guide and forced to choose. Now, Sartre fought back against some of the criticisms of his existentialism, particularly the accusation that it was a lonely pursuit and ultimately subjective. But it is telling that time and again, when he turned his mind towards producing a book on existentialist ethics to answer his critics like he promised, as well as to describe how we should live in the world with each other happily and authentically, he couldn't finish it. His notes on ethics weren't fully published in his lifetime, and they never really came together. Even in his lecture on existentialism, Sartre says that, quote, freedom is the foundation of all values, but he never really gets around to nailing down why and how this works in detail. And while he described every individual choice as also choosing for others, it was never entirely clear how this worked, except that it might have been stolen from Nietzsche. In Sartre's own life, it led him to one universal cause after another, including embracing anti-colonialism, a form of communism, protest movements, and most famously, the May 1968 French student protests. But all of this never really cohered into something philosophers would consider a systematic approach to ethics or to philosophy. What he saw as his great masterwork, The Critique of Dialectical Reason, which was aimed to unify existentialism on the one hand and Marxism of the other, was never finished. In fact, it seemed impossible to finish. It's also impossible to read, but that's another thing. Sartre's philosophy is great when you need a bit of tough love, when you need to be told that your life is short and your own, and only you can choose what to do with it. As a commentator points out in the introduction to Sartre's lecture, the ideas that nourished his entire work are responsibility, project, freedom, action, individual, and solitude. And in this emphasis, Sartre reminds me of another great philosopher of today, Ron Swanson.
Never half-ass two things. Whole-ass one thing. Son, there's no wrong way to consume alcohol. Live your life how you want, but don't confuse drama with happiness. You know what makes a good person good? When a good person does something bad, they own up to it. They try to learn something from it, and they move on.
I have a suspicion that despite Sartre being French, they would have gotten on like a house on fire. Hey, it helps that they both love breakfast. And Sartre gives a new spin on the golden rule and Kant's categorical imperative. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which focuses on how our choices could increase the freedom and perhaps even the happiness of everybody. But that is also one of the problems with Sartre's philosophy. Because in Sartre's view of things, life is a perpetual crusade to become yourself and to actualize your own individual truth. It's yet another thing he kind of stole from Nietzsche. But just like Nietzsche, it might just be a very lonely and unhappy quest. In the end, Sartre says, we can define man only in relation to his commitments. That is, the things we choose and the projects we choose to be a part of. This severeness and unhappiness in Sartre's philosophy is strange because Sartre lived a life full of friends and wild experiences. Yet it's telling that when he disagreed with his friends on political or intellectual matters, he tended to cut them off for good, which I suppose is ultimately his choice and his alone. I think that ultimately, despite the good in Sartre's version of existentialism, there are other existentialists that we might find far more attractive and helpful. A little less stern and a little more focused on the joyous things in life. For example, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, he talks about the joy of seeing a bird spring from the branch of a tree where it's resting and leap into flight on a beautiful day. Or Gabriel Marcel, who talks about that sense of wonder and exploration in life. Or Levinas, who talks about the thrill of meeting that, other philosophers and existentialists manage to capture. But in his defense, let me leave you with something a little wonderful from Jean-Paul Sartre. At the height of his fame, he was asked by France's most prestigious university, the Sorbonne, to address its students. And he told them, quote, "The only way to learn is to question." Great advice, even if, under his own philosophical rules, he's technically not allowed to give it. So that, in brief, was Jean-Paul Sartre. And I get that this was the skimpiest, lightest summary of a philosopher that wrote dozens of novels and gigantic philosophical works. Put a comment below and tell us what you thought of him or his philosophy, as well as if you're interested in going deeper into his big works like Being and Nothingness or Nausea. There's some good stuff in there. And some weird stuff too. His work on the imaginary, for example, is probably my favourite of all. In it, he points out that only beings with consciousness can be disappointed because they can imagine something that doesn't exist and then be upset when they find out it isn't there. It's kind of like expecting to find a $50 note in your wallet and then opening it up and remembering, oh, that's right, I'm poor now because I had to buy eggs. But if Sartre isn't your speed or style, then stay tuned for the next video, because in it, we look at Jean-Paul Sartre's lifelong friend, companion, and lover. Oh, and she was arguably a better philosopher and writer than he was. That's a hot take. Like and subscribe if you like hot takes. Or until next time, remember to be wise and to be kind. And if invisible crabs start chasing you down the street, see a doctor immediately. Not me, obviously, a medical doctor.